All the affidavits from all the policemen in the world won't protest his eyes back in his head. Somebody who called himself an officer of the law beat that boy with a stick until he lost his sight. Now that somebody is nobody. He's vanished. He's never been heard of. He hasn't any name. Well, he's going to be heard of. The blind soldier has my promise of that. That somebody is going to be named. Editorials and lots of newspapers and lots of people are writing me to demand to know what business it is of mine. God judge me if it isn't the most pressing business I have. The blind soldier fought for me in this war. The least I can do now is fight for him. I have eyes. He hasn't. I have a voice on the radio. He hasn't. I was born a white man. And until a colored man is a full citizen like me, I haven't the leisure to enjoy the freedom that colored man risked his life to maintain for me.
On February 12, 1946, World War II veteran Sergeant Isaac Woodard was left blind after a vicious attack by a white South Carolina police chief, in what was an all-too-common scene for many black veterans returning from the war. Inundated by public pressure following a radio broadcast by Orson Welles, President Truman ordered a federal investigation. Despite a national outcry and the push from Truman to bring the attacker to justice, the perpetrator was acquitted by an all-white jury. Woodard's and many other such stories experienced by Black Americans sparked public outrage and a discussion about race relations in America. President Truman personally struggled with the decision on how to approach civil rights, but he eventually issued Executive Order 9981, which ended segregation in the military, the first federal branch to do so. However, that decision did not come without political consequences from the Dixiecrat South, threatening Truman's re-election bid and splitting the Democratic Party.
I, Harry S. Truman, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. So help me God.
You're listening to the Best of My Ability, the Post-War Years, from the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. This is Episode 7, A Dangerous, Costly, and Heartbreaking Process. I'm your host, Dr. Kristen Burton. This week, Sergeant Isaac Woodard is left blinded by a racially motivated attack committed by law enforcement, sending shockwaves around the country as more attacks on Black veterans followed. Joining us is Dr. Matthew Delmont, Sherman Fairchild Distinguished Professor of History at Dartmouth College and the author of the upcoming book, Half American, the epic story of African Americans fighting World War II at home and abroad.
Isaac Woodard's military career is really pretty typical for Black men. He enlisted in October of 1942 as a 23-year-old, and he trained at Fort Jackson in Columbia, South Carolina. He served in the Pacific Theater in a labor battalion as a longshoreman. He was eventually promoted to sergeant, but that kind of labor work was very typical for how Black soldiers served during the war. And so his story is really an archetypal one. This wasn't technically a combat role, but he was unloading ships under enemy fire in New Guinea. So he saw war action, even if he wasn't in a frontline combat role. So he's not the kind of soldier that makes it in the movies, but the kind of unsung role that Black troops really played throughout the war. So after the war, he was honorably discharged in February of 1946. And after he was discharged, he was on a Greyhound bus home, going from Camp Gordon in Augusta, Georgia, traveling to his family home in North Carolina. There was some dispute with the bus driver. He wanted to get off the bus to be able to use the rest stop and go to the bathroom. The bus driver accused him of drinking in the back of the bus. But when they got to a town called Batesburg, South Carolina, the bus driver stops the bus and calls the local police, who come and take Woodard off of the bus. They bring him in an alley and just start beating him with their nightsticks, beat him pretty severely, and then arrest him and accuse him of disorderly conduct, accuse him of being drunk on the bus. They get him back to the station, and the beating continues. The police chief is using his nightstick and uses the butt end of it to essentially gouge out Woodard's eyes, or to make really severe damage into his orbital, his eye sockets. It ends up blinding him. That kind of abuse by police and other authorities of Black veterans and Black citizens more generally wasn't at all uncommon during the war or after the war, but the type of violence and the fact that Woodard was blinded by it really stuck out.
The following morning, the police brought Woodard in front of a local judge, who found him guilty, fining him $50. It would take some days before Woodard was taken to a nearby Veterans Administration hospital, where it was confirmed that he was permanently blind. The discharging doctor's recommendation? That he should attend a school for the blind.
So the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, is really the leading civil rights organization in this era. They grew a tremendous number of branches and members over the course of the war, and they're just fighting constantly throughout the war for Black troops and for Black veterans. They really lead the effort to publicize Woodard's case. They're working usually hand in hand with the Black press, African-American press across the country, tried to publicize cases of this kind of violence that particularly Black troops and Black veterans would experience. So those were traditional. Those happened for almost all these cases, and that was no exception for Woodard. I think the thing that helps Woodard's case break through to a larger audience is when Orson Welles tells the story on his ABC radio show.
Good morning, this is Orson Welles speaking. I'd like to read to you an affidavit. I, Isaac Woodward, Jr., being duly sworn, do depose and state as follows. That I am 27 years old and a veteran of the United States Army, having served for 15 months in the South Pacific and earned 1 battle star. I was honorably discharged on February 12, 1946, from Camp Gordon, Georgia, at 8:30 p.m. at the Greyhound Terminal, Atlanta, Georgia. While I was in uniform, I purchased a ticket to Winnsboro, South Carolina, and took the bus headed there to pick up my wife to come to New York to see my father and mother. About 1 hour out of Atlanta, the bus driver stopped at a small drugstore. As he stopped, I asked him if he had time to wait for me until I had a chance to go to the restroom. He cursed and said no. When he cursed me, I cursed him back. When the bus got to Aiken, he got off and went and got the police. They didn't give me a chance to explain. The policeman struck me with a billy across my head and told me to shut up. After that, the policeman grabbed me by my left arm and twisted it behind my back. I figured he was trying to make me resist. I did not resist against him. He asked me, was I discharged? And I told him yes. When I said yes, that is when he started beating me with a billy, hitting me across the top of the head. After that, I grabbed his billy and wrung it out of his hand. Another policeman came up and threw his gun on me and told me to drop the billy, and he dropped me, so I dropped the billy. After I dropped the billy, the second policeman held his gun on me while the other one was beating me. He knocked me unconscious. After I commenced to come to myself, he hollered, "Get up." When I started to get up, he started punching me in my eyes with the end of the billy. When I finally got up, he pushed me inside the jailhouse and locked me up. I woke up next morning and could not see.
Welles did not stop with just reading the affidavit from Isaac Woodard. He devoted 4 more broadcasts to demand justice for Woodard and voice his concern about hate crimes committed against Black Americans.
Wash your hands, Officer X. Wash them well. Scrub and scour. You won't blot out the blood of a blinded war veteran. Nor yet the color of your skin, your own skin. You'll never, never, never change it. Wash your hands, Officer X. Wash a lifetime. You'll never wash away that leprous lack of pigment, the guilty pallor of the white man. We invite you to luxuriate in secrecy. It will be brief. Go on. Suckle your anonymous moment while it lasts. You're going to be uncovered. We will blast out your name. We'll give the world your given name, Officer X. Yes, and your so-called Christian name. It's going to rise out of the filthy deep like the dead thing it is. We're going to make it public with a public scandal you dictated but failed to sign.
And one of the important things that Welles does is he reveals the name of the police chief. It was a man named Linwood Shull. That was uncommon at the time. It was usually the case that these Southern police departments would kind of close ranks around whoever the officer was who was directly responsible for the beating or for the killing. Welles kind of pulled back the veil on that, and by revealing the police chief's name, helped to spark even more nationwide attention to the case and these kind of calls for justice.
After the broadcast, many letters were sent to the White House pleading for the Truman administration to do something about the case. Walter Francis White, executive secretary for the NAACP, met with President Truman at the Oval Office to discuss the case on September 19, 1946. And on September 26th, Truman directed the Justice Department to open a federal investigation. Feeling too much responsibility to care for a now disabled Woodard, his wife left him. Woodard's sisters moved him to the Bronx so he could be looked after by family.
by October of 1946, he's living in the Bronx and has recovered. He's able to move now. And he goes on a national speaking tour and sponsored by the NAACP to try to raise awareness about the kind of violence that Black veterans are encountering. And the picture of him in his Army uniform with his eyes completely bandaged shows up in papers all across the country. And that helps to keep the story in the news. And I think really is an iconic photo, almost on par to the kind of Emmett Till lynching photos in that come a decade later, and that it really revealed to people the depth of brutality that Black veterans were facing. One of the things that Woodard says in his speaking tour, and this is a quote from one of the papers, he says, "Negro veterans that fought in this war don't realize that the real battle has just begun in America. They went overseas and did their duty, and now they're at home and have to fight another struggle. And I think that outweighs the war." And so I think for a lot of people in 1946, Woodard really became a symbol of the kind of unresolved question about democracy in the United States, that you have Black veterans who had done everything they could to serve their country proudly, and they came home and not only were they not treated as full citizens, but they were actually treated even worse. They were harassed and experienced violence, in some cases because of their service.
Attacks continued on Black veterans and many Black Americans, like John Cecil Jones, an honorably discharged corporal who was tortured and lynched in Minden, Louisiana. Often these heinous crimes were covered up by local law enforcement and led to few repercussions for the criminals who committed these violent attacks. 2 weeks after Woodard was attacked, James Stephenson, another World War II veteran, walked into a department store in Columbia, Tennessee with his mother to collect their radio, which had been dropped off earlier for repairs.
So James Stephenson was a U.S. Navy veteran who had served in the Pacific theater. He and his mother were picking up a radio that had been repaired at a local department store. And the young white clerk at the department store starts to harass Stephenson's mother, threatens her physically and is calling her all sorts of names. James Stephenson intervenes, and the two men start to wrestle, so Stephenson and the white clerk. They eventually crash through a department store window. And then the local police arrive, who are all white. They arrest both Stephenson and his mother, whose name was Gladys. Things escalated when the white clerk's father charges Stephenson with assault with intent to commit murder, which was a felony. A local Black businessman posted bond, which allowed Stephenson to return home. But by that night, the story was just all over town. Both the white and Black communities are on edge. So by nightfall, there's a white mob, hundreds of people who gather around the county courthouse. And just about a block away in the Black business district, there's an almost equally sized mob or a group of hundreds of Black military veterans and citizens who gather to defend the Black community. The Columbia police chief sends in 4 patrolmen into this area. There's some sort of shouting involved. The officers are asked to stop. They don't stop, and someone starts firing. 4 of the officers are wounded. And then after that, state highway patrolmen and police officers flood into the Black district and start beating Black community members, Black citizens. They start going into homes, breaking into businesses, just all sorts of kind of violence. And then they arrest dozens and dozens of Black citizens who had been there trying to defend their neighborhood and their property. 2 days later, white policemen kill 2 of the Black prisoners who are in custody. They accuse the prisoners of reaching for guns and then shoot them as a result and shoot and kill them. And so this story, again, receives national attention. The NAACP's lead lawyer, who's at the time Thurgood Marshall, who goes on to become the first Black Supreme Court justice, of course, flies to Nashville to organize a legal defense. And eventually, again, the case comes before an all-white jury who acquits the white police officers of any wrongdoing. But the kind of larger impact of the story is that it's less than a year after the end of the war. And so for a lot of Black Americans, both in the South and across the nation, they're really kind of left asking, is this what we fought for?
James Stephenson was ultimately never tried, nor was his mother, despite the pleas of the white store clerk's father to charge both with attempted murder. Only one Black man was convicted of murder, Lloyd Kennedy. Thurgood Marshall would become the target of harassment by the police following the case. In one instance, white officers arrested him for drunk driving and took him on a terrifying drive in the remote countryside before finally dropping him off at a magistrate's office, all charges dropped. As for the case against Woodard's attackers, the Justice Department's investigation was lackluster, and though the officers were indicted, the trial was a farce. On November 5, 1946, after a brief deliberation, Linwood Shull was found not guilty, a major blow to the Truman administration and its efforts to quell the growing threat of homegrown white supremacy. Shull would continue out his life without punishment in Batesburg, South Carolina, dying at the age of 95 on December 27, 1997. Despite the lack of a conviction in Isaac Woodard's case, both Woodard's and James Stephenson's cases motivated President Truman to establish the Civil Rights Commission in 1946 by Executive Order 9808. A 15-member interracial group of academics and activists produced a report in 1947 entitled To Secure These Rights, the Report of the President's Committee on Civil Rights. Part of the committee's recommendation was desegregating the military, writing, quote, "Equal treatment can produce equal performance."
So civil rights activists have been calling for the desegregation of the armed forces for more than a decade, and it intensifies after the war. A. Philip Randolph, who before the war, in 1941, before Pearl Harbor, had threatened to lead a massive march of Black citizens in Washington, D.C. He had threatened President Roosevelt with that. He continues that activism after the war. So in 1948, he leads a group that said they would encourage Black Americans not to register for the new Selective Service Act and to refuse to serve in a segregated military. And so that really gets Truman's attention. A. Philip Randolph is one of the best known African-American leaders and activists nationally. And so for him to make that threat really got the president's attention. It also, Truman has fears that it looks especially bad in the Cold War era. So as the U.S. is increasingly competing with Russia for the attention of countries in other parts of the world who are trying to make this choice between sort of capitalism and democracy and communism, it looks bad to have someone like A. Philip Randolph threatening to keep Black people out of the military. Truman, I mentioned before, he had the Committee on Civil Rights. They issued their report, which is called To Secure These Rights. They issued that in 1947. And it calls on the White House, Congress, and the state legislatures to adopt nearly 36 wide-ranging proposals, which include ending poll taxes, passing voting rights and federal anti-lynching legislation, outlining racial housing covenants, establishing a federal Fair Employment Practices Act, and finally ending military segregation. How they term it is to protect the dignity of the uniform in the armed services. From white Southern constituents, they see these recommendations as really a frontal attack on Jim Crow. And so he has to see, like, am I willing to implement any of these at the risk of losing votes from almost all of the South? At the same time, Truman sees that there is increasing voting power, particularly in Black communities in states in the North and Midwest. What he ends up deciding is that given the composition of Congress, particularly the number of Southerners who have leadership positions there, he can't get most of those recommendations through Congress, or they would take years to pass. The one thing he has the authority to do as the commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy is to desegregate the armed forces. So on July 26, 1948, he signs Executive Order 9981, which commits the government to desegregating the military. And about a month later, he's right to expect that there was going to be significant pushback from Southerners. So Southern delegates walk out of the Democratic National Convention, and they break off and form the States' Rights Democratic Party, which is colloquially called the Dixiecrats, and nominate South Carolina Governor Strom Thurmond for the presidential election.
Truman would go on to narrowly win the 1948 election, despite the opposition from the Dixiecrats. He suffered politically by losing the Solid South that once voted strongly Democrat. And even though President Truman was exempt from term limitations set in the 22nd Amendment, he would not seek re-election in 1952. Sergeant Isaac Woodard and his story would continue to shape both American politics and popular culture for the next decade. Folk singer Woody Guthrie penned the song The Blinding of Isaac Woodard and performed it for tens of thousands of concertgoers, hoping to both honor Woodard and ensure that no one forgot the crime that was committed against him and the miscarriage of justice that allowed his attackers to go free. Woodard lived the rest of his life in New York City and died in 1992 at the age of 73. He was buried with military honors at the Calverton National Cemetery.
was totally illogical from a logistical perspective to send a segregated military to fight in World War II. It made no logistical sense. It was only because the racism was so deeply rooted in the United States that they did that. So they could have, for all intents and purposes, have integrated in 1938. I think that would have been preferable, certainly for most African Americans. But at the same time, Truman signed this order in 1948. It's the first federal office, first federal branch in the country to be desegregated. So it comes before schools, it comes before you have the important civil rights legislation that's going to apply to employment and to housing. So the military, while it could have happened earlier and while activists want it to happen earlier, it still is, it's path-breaking that it does happen when it does in the late 1940s and early 1950s. And so I think more than anything, what I want people to come away from listening to this with is an understanding that Black Americans were absolutely critical to the war effort, that they served their country proudly, even in the face of tremendous racism.
In our next episode, The Temper of the Courts, a California court hears arguments challenging the practice of segregating students of Mexican descent into, quote, remedial schools for Mexicans. Sylvia Mendez and her family spent the next year of their lives entangled in a court battle. From the National World War II Museum, I'm Dr. Kristen Burton. This episode was written by digital content manager Bert Hidalgo, who also did the sound mixing. Archival audio is courtesy of the Orson Welles on the Air project at Indiana University Libraries. If you like this podcast, please rate and review us or leave us a comment on your favorite podcast platform, which helps others to find the series. To the Best of My Ability is part of an ongoing series of programs commemorating the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II, made possible by the Nierenberg family.